We might be a small island, but we've got an epic history. And there's a wealth of untold secrets still to uncover. So every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive, and sift to find clues.
Absolutely.
Never seen anything
like it before.
It's amazing.
In 2018, their discoveries have been more exciting than ever.
Look at that.
So that's from a tank then? That's brilliant. That's a nice find.
Not bad for day 2.
Not bad at all.
Each excavation has been filmed as it happened by the archaeologists themselves. Their dig diaries mean that we can be there for every exciting moment of discovery.
And you imagine him looking over his shoulder, trying to get away from the enemy aircraft through that.
I'll be in the lab where the teams will bring in their finds from pottery and metalwork to human remains, and we'll take a closer look to find out what these new digs can tell us about our ancestors. Look at that.
Be very careful.
I will be careful. Oh my goodness. While archaeologist Raksha Dave looks into the analysis that goes on long after a dig is finished.
Somebody stabbed her in the back of the head. What an awful way to go.
Welcome to Digging for Britain. In this programme, I'm joining archaeologists in the west of the country to share their biggest discoveries. At Silchester, we investigate a monumental bathhouse, revealing how the Romans first stamped their mark on Britain.
The preservation of the blocks and the bricks is absolutely superb.
In Bath, construction work beneath the magnificent medieval Abbey takes us on an incredible journey through the city's multi-layered hidden past.
This is probably late 13th or 14th century. Quite incredible that this has survived.
And near Winchester, a team unlocked the secrets of a vast 18th century military camp occupied by a horde of German mercenaries.
It looks gold leaf on it. It's really, really shiny. It's not something you expect in a military field kitchen.
No, not at all.
And at the Museum of Somerset in Taunton, I'll discover how objects here help us tell the story of the West. Our first dig takes us off the coast of Portsmouth to a major underwater investigation into an 18th century ship that revolutionised the Royal Navy. There are around 40,000 ships wrecked around the British coastline, but the chance to excavate one is incredibly rare. It is monumentally expensive and usually only happens when the ship is of national importance and under threat of destruction. Now, both are true for HMS Invincible, and this is the largest underwater excavation since the Mary Rose. For centuries, our nation's power lay in our maritime might. But at the start of the 18th century, Britain's navy was in danger of losing its edge. Then, in 1747, the Royal Navy captured the French ship L'Invincible, a cutting-edge, streamlined 74-gun ship that could literally blow anything out of the water. Renamed HMS Invincible, it became the flagship of the British Navy until it ran aground on the 19th of February, 1758. The wreck of the Invincible provides us with an unprecedented opportunity to discover how the 18th century Navy was being revolutionised. And now that shifting sands are putting the wreck under threat, no expense is being spared to recover as much as possible. A combined team from Bournemouth University, the Maritime Archaeology Trust and the National Museum of the Royal Navy is carrying out this £2 million project to salvage the remains of the wreck. And halfway through the 3-year project, the clock is ticking to retrieve what evidence is left.
It's all about trying to recover as much as we can, record it as quickly as we can, because during the winter we have high energy storm events, and this is exposing vulnerable and fragile artefacts as well as the ship structure.
The maritime archaeologists rely on huge suction tubes to suck up the sand and blow it away from the site. They're constantly battling the threatening tides. But on day one, precious artifacts begin to surface. One of the first things to come up, a fully intact gunpowder barrel.
There would have been over 300 barrels of gunpowder on board. That's the gunpowder. And actually you see underwater when they're moving it, you just get clouds of black. It is a pretty bad smell. So that's the sulphur.
It's a great start, indicating that some of the key armaments are still on board. And with their expert eyes scouring the wreck, the divers are soon rewarded with even more gun accessories.
These coins here, coins were used for supporting the breech end of the guns, clearly labelled with the gun type. So here we have the 9-pounder coin, and next to it, the much larger 32-pounder coin. Everything's labelled. So when you've got the chaos of battle going on, they know exactly where to go to get the 32-pounder coin, the 9-pounder.
With every new discovery, the archaeologists are revealing why Invincible was such a formidable ship. And it wasn't just her superlative firepower.
We're learning where they stored things, how they stored things. It shows the organisation, the professionalism, the discipline.
As the season nears its end, the archaeologists suddenly make their most exciting discovery yet. Guns. The Invincible bristled with an amazing 74 cannons, but until now the team had thought that many of these had been recovered when the ship was wrecked.
But what's really important about this is an unexpected find. We assumed that all of the guns that weren't jettisoned were recovered from the Invincible, so it's great that we found these.
These guns are a rare and important discovery, and I've invited site directors Dan and Dave into the studio to discuss the team's finds and what they've learned about the ship that revolutionised our Navy.
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Dan, looking at you excavating this ship, it looks as though it's incredibly shallow.
It is. The site is only in 8 to 9 metres of water.
And being that shallow, presumably as soon as you do get a storm, it's hugely at risk because the energy of the waves will be transmitted down.
Exactly.
Then material becomes exposed. You can see from the 2 blocks at the end there, they were identical when made and they both ended up in the water at the same time. But one is still perfect and that was buried within the wreck. But once things are exposed, they're a food source for marine life and they just disappear.
And is this one of the smaller guns that came up?
Yes, this is called a swivel gun. It's an anti-personnel weapon. So it's when you come close to the enemy, when you're side by side. And we found them low down on the ship. So they weren't in use at the time. So we're learning something new, that they stored these weapons and were only going to bring them out when they needed them, when they were at close quarters with the enemy. And we weren't expecting to find these. So it was a really nice addition to the finds.
And I think one of the most overwhelming things is the smell. Is that the rope that we can smell?
That is the rope. It kind of takes you back in time.
Yeah.
This is a smell that hasn't changed since 1758. And this is exactly what the sailors would have smelt. It's that tar, it's the pitch.
Tarry, yeah. And it still smells 250 years later.
I know, I really love it. It enables us as archaeologists to really sense what it was like on board the ship.
Yeah.
And we found out that it's actually junk. So it wasn't going to be used in the rigging. It was going to be used in the making of these objects, which are known as gun wads.
So the old rope that's in the bottom of the ship is there to be picked apart and made into these wads?
That's it. So it's for the process of loading and firing the guns. You would load the cannons, ramming down your powder charge with this. This is a rammer head. You would then ram down one of those wads to kind of seal the charge. You would then ram down the shot. And to stop that shot rolling back out the barrel of the gun, you would have to ram down another wad.
Yeah.
So they're essential.
And what about these pieces of wood here with marks on? What are they?
And these are tally sticks that went with these wads to show which size of gun they would be used for. So in Roman numerals, we have 32
Yeah.
for the 32-pounder.
And 24.
And 24 for the 24-pounder. So this shows the organisation on board.
And what have you got in that box?
Well, what I've got here is a small timer.
Look at that.
It's used for calculating the speed of the vessel.
Dave, is that glass?
That's glass.
And it's intact?
It's intact, as it was when the ship sank, and it was found on the shelf it was placed on when it was last used.
Can I hold it?
You can, but be very careful.
I will be careful.
OK.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's a 28-second timer, because you run a length of rope over the stern of the vessel with knots in every 47 feet.
Yeah.
And after 28 seconds, the number of knots that have run through your hands are the speed of the vessel.
Yeah, yeah.
So they have
That gives you the
28
knots.
seconds. That's what.
Yeah.
That's where knots comes from. That's
Yeah.
right.
I just cannot believe that this has survived intact 250 years on the seabed, and it's made of wood and glass, and there it is. It's perfect. And I'm really nervous about holding it, so I'm going to hand it back to you.
Should we put it back?
Dave.
Okay,
Oh, my
I've got it.
goodness. So what we've got here is an astonishing demonstration of the level of organisation that was going on in the Navy by the 18th century.
That's it. We have the evidence for a well-organised, disciplined Navy, which is a complete contrast to the previous century, where they're a lot more dysfunctional. There's been catastrophic disasters due to a lack of discipline and organisation on board.
This ambitious dig has revealed exactly why HMS Invincible became the model for future cutting-edge ship design in the British Navy, and why in the century that followed, Britain could boast that it ruled the waves. We stay in the 18th century next as we head to Barton Farm near Winchester, to a dig that gives us a rare insight into an unusual, forgotten moment in Britain's military past. Archaeologists were called in to evaluate this site before a new housing development got started, because historical plans recorded that a vast military encampment had stood here in the 18th century, housing 9,000 German soldiers.
These were not prisoners of war, nor an invading force that has somehow slipped under the historical radar. These troops were invited here.
In 1756, King George II, of German descent himself, invited an army from Hesse in Germany over to keep Britain safe and to wage wars against its enemies.
This is the first opportunity to get a really detailed insight into what life was like in the Hessian camp, and also, perhaps, a clue as to what made them such a formidable fighting force.
A team from Pre-Construct Archaeology is carrying out the dig into this unique German camp, joined by MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood and his team of ex-soldiers turned archaeologists.
This is where the Hessians were based in 1756. They were here for 10 months in what was a pretty cold and miserable winter. And to get themselves shelter, they dug down into the solid chalk. They provided themselves with dugouts, with field kitchens, in quite a regular pattern.
The team have a contemporary plan of the camp. However, they don't know how accurate it is or what the internal structures were really like. But once they start digging, the outlines of the camp are clearly visible in the hard chalk, and it seems to be even more massive and highly regimented than they'd thought.
These square features are the footprints of field kitchens, and the camp extended for a distance of some 1 kilometre from roughly where we're speaking, right over in the far distance towards the houses over there.
The whole camp is far too big to dig in its entirety, and the team are only focusing on the field kitchens and the dugouts affected by the housing development. They hope that this will tell them how both were constructed and what living conditions might have been like, and they quickly find their first clues.
So it looks like we've got the neck of a bottle here. Oh, cool. The glassware's very similar to wine bottles.
As digging continues, the team finds further tantalising clues about life in the German soldiers' camp.
We are finding loads and loads of oyster shells. We've also got clay pipes. It's quite tempting to think of these Hessians actually sitting around eating oysters, which were much more commonplace as a food substance in those days, and smoking away.
The finds are painting a picture of how the Hessian troops whiled away the hours waiting for action. And although this is essentially temporary accommodation, the dugouts are well built and would have been surprisingly comfortable.
The really lovely thing about this is this chimney. It's a remarkable feature. You've got a series of mortared bricks in place, and then you've got a mortared area up here which forms the flue of the chimney, and this must have been a real godsend, absolutely critical. From having spoken to the soldiers on the site, is keeping yourself warm in the dugouts. The other thing we've got in this area is a series of stake holes cut into the chalk, and those represent where timber uprights were put in place. They would have enabled the roof structure, probably like a tent, to go over the top.
The preservation of the dugouts is creating a remarkably clear picture. These were solidly built, heated structures, roofed over with canvas. Quite cosy then, but also cramped, as up to 50 men could have been living in each one. As well as the dugouts, the other main features on site are a string of field kitchens that catered for the 9,000-strong horde of soldiers, and they're producing some equally interesting finds.
What have you got, Rob?
So it's a mid-18th century pot, red glazed pot.
And this is in one of the little ovens cut into the Hessian field kitchen.
Hessian cookhouses.
That's super cool. What have you found?
Well, I've got a little pin, which is beautifully preserved, and also just found a little button.
I mean, that'll clean up beautifully, won't it? It's still got really nice decoration on it, but it's also got gold leaf on it, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really, really shiny. It's not the sort of thing you expect in a military field kitchen.
No, not at all.
This is such an intriguing and unusual site. I've invited Richard and site director Paul into the lab to find out more. I think sites like this are great. We've got a very clear idea of what's there from this map, but actually still it's quite difficult to imagine how this plays out on the ground and, you know, the organisation of it. So to have this opportunity is fantastic.
Yeah, to know the actual structural form of these dugouts and the kitchens and the sorts of elements that they indicate about the lives of the people that were here in 1756, you can get a certain amount from this, but you've got to do the digging to find out.
Because looking at this, it just looks like a tented camp, doesn't it? You're not really given that idea that it's
like
much
kind
more
of Glastonbury
permanent.
or something, doesn't
yeah,
it? But,
yeah.
Very
well,
different.
slightly regimented Glastonbury.
Exactly, would be probably better lose.
And Richard, you're there digging with soldiers who were in Operation Nightingale. Were they
impressed?
impressed?
A real envy that they had such nice features in the 1750s compared to what they call shell scrapes nowadays and just little gouges into the ground, where these things were beautifully constructed.
With staircases and fireplaces, and sometimes some of them with ledges to sit on, perhaps. And
cut-ups for candles in some places. They're quite ornate in many ways, and it's perhaps surprising when you think of the conditions of the time that they have put so much effort into building these structures.
And that button we saw coming up in the trench, didn't we?
Yeah, that's the one from one of the field kitchens, and so you see the shiny gilding on it.
Yeah. They're quite ornate for soldiers, aren't they?
They don't look military, do they? They don't look martial. We're tempted to think that you see the little schematic illustrations in the plan of these locals coming out to look at the Hessians, because they must have been a real curiosity for folk from Winchester.
That's what these people in the carriages are doing.
And it's tempting to think that sort of ornate button just might be dropped from one of these people who come to see their allies in the field in Winchester.
And you recovered quite a few finds, giving us a bit of an insight into the day-to-day lives of these soldiers.
Yes, soldiers spend a lot of time waiting for things to happen, don't they? And you imagine that they spent a lot of time just eating and smoking and drinking day after day, month after month. And here we have a very nice example of an enamelled glass schnapps bottle that presumably one of the members of the army actually brought with him, you know, with his own supply of special spirits, perhaps.
Yeah. So they're enjoying a bit of local beer and German schnapps in their dugouts. I think what's particularly interesting is that when you think of an efficient army, very often we focus on, you know, what they're doing in battle, tactics, all of that sort of thing. But actually, this is equally important, if actually not more important, how you keep troops well-fed, comfortable, in good fighting form when you're not actually on the front line.
Yeah, without decent logistics and morale, you're not going to succeed, and so that's a crucial part of this story for sure.
Yeah. The dig has given us a unique insight into a forgotten moment in our military history. The order and sophistication of the camp revealing why the Hessians were such crack troops and were invited over by George II. And here, at the museum in Somerset, a rather personal item belonging to the King himself provides another insight into George's military campaigns and his connections with Germany. Tom, tell me about these trousers then, or in fact, they're not really trousers, are they?
Well, I think we need to call them breeches. That's what they would have been called at the time. They're remarkable because they belong to no less a person than George II, King of England for 33 years, from 1727 to 1760. And more remarkably, he wore them at the Battle of Dettingen in Germany, and it was the very last time an English monarch led his troops into battle.
Quite an extraordinary item to be wearing, and incredibly colourful. I mean, you know, he was not going for camouflage here.
No, he wanted to be a visible symbol of monarchy and of leadership, and he was renowned as being a very brave sovereign.
So he would have cut a fine and very noticeable figure wearing these bright red breeches, and they've got gorgeous gold buttons as well.
They have, yes. The buttons are a very fine embellishment.
They're very beautiful. The material is slightly felty to the touch.
Yes.
Beautifully fine stitching, and I've noticed that the pockets are made of incredibly fine leather. So I've heard of kid gloves, but here are kid pockets.
Kid pockets, yes.
Yeah.
They're of the very highest quality, and as I suppose you'd expect for the King of England and the Elector of Hanover. He didn't settle for second best, even when he was on the battlefield.
So was George still, at this point, a ruler of Hanover?
Yes, he was. Throughout his life, he had two roles, as Elector of Hanover and as King of England.
But those Hanoverian connections surely explain why he later brings over the troops, the Hessian troops.
When he arrived in England in 1727, he found an army which was under strength and not at all experienced. And Hessian troops were really the means by which he strengthened the British army and made it fit for battle in European campaigns.
So how did the breeches end up here in the Museum of Somerset?
Well, they were purchased in 1982 as part of a job lot of costume, so that it's partly an accident, but it's a happy accident because some of the troops who fought at Dettingen were the 13th Regiment of Foot, who became the Somerset Light Infantry.
So there is a Somerset connection, and Somerset men would have seen George II riding into battle in these resplendent breeches.
They would, and it's very good that they've survived, and rather remarkable that they have.
Yeah.
Our next investigation takes us to Salisbury and into the labs of Wessex archaeology, where experts are analysing over 100 skeletons from a recently unearthed 19th century pauper's graveyard. In 2016, Wessex Archaeology began working alongside developers who were about to build on the disused new Covent Garden Flower Market site in Battersea, London. 150 years ago, a graveyard occupied this site, but everyone thought that it had been fully removed in the 1960s. So the team was surprised to find that a 100-metre strip at the edge of the cemetery still remained. In the 19th century, this was where the poorest would have been buried, so it's an exciting discovery. These skeletons have to be exhumed, ready for reburial, but this gives us a precious opportunity to look at life and death for some of the poorest people in 19th century Britain, just as cities were becoming utterly transformed by industrialisation. To find out what the post-excavation work can tell us about these individuals, archaeologist Raksha Dave is visiting the Wessex labs and meeting osteoarchaeologist Kirsten Dinwiddie.
I want to find out how months of forensic work is building up a detailed picture of the lives of each individual. The skeleton currently being analysed is a middle-aged woman.
So what we do is you use this osteometric board, and then you put the bone in.
Okay, very gentle there.
Yeah.
Right, so that is 44 centimetres.
Okay, so that indicates a fairly average stature.
The thing that I have noticed whilst picking up this bone is it looks really odd around here. It's a bit lumpy bumpy.
It's very lumpy bumpy. If you turn it over, you can see it really is quite disfigured. Around the bone you have a membrane called the periosteum. And if that gets inflamed or irritated in any way, it can cause the bone to overgrow.
So what would have caused that?
Well, any kind of inflammation, so it could be a direct trauma, but this doesn't look like that. The other cause could be some kind of infection throughout the body that might irritate and cause this reaction. And I've got fairly conclusive proof that she suffered from syphilis. If we look at the skull here, quite difficult to show, but if you look...
Oh, I can see actually from this angle. So this side is kind of smooth.
Yeah.
And then there's kind of like these knobbly bits here.
Yeah. The particular lesions, they're very characteristic of syphilis. So it sort of eats away at the bone, but then it starts healing. And as it heals, it sort of folds and rolls into the edges. So you get this kind of star-like pattern. And if you look at this, I can actually change the direction of the light source. And actually you can pick ones
that's
up.
Incredible.
So where you said it was smooth, you can actually see.
It actually isn't.
No. There is a lesion there.
Do we know if the syphilis was actually contracted or was it congenital?
We think that it was congenital, so that means that her mother had the disease and passed it on to her.
So she had syphilis all her life?
Yeah.
Do we know how she died?
Unusually so, we do in this case. If we just take her skull here, do you notice anything?
Is that what I think it is? Is that a puncture wound?
Yes, it is.
And am I right in thinking if this was an old wound, you would have actually seen signs of the bone regrowing back into
That's right, and there's absolutely no sign of that at all. And if you notice, it's all sort of folded in.
Somebody stabbed her in the back of the head?
Yeah, so that's just behind the right ear.
What an awful way to go. This poor woman.
This woman's murder may well have been unreported, as was often the case in poorer areas. But the prevalence of chronic diseases was documented. Surveys suggest that around 10% of the urban poor had syphilis. And further work here on a male skeleton is proving just how tough life was in Battersea's 19th century slums.
There is something that I can see,
yes,
and it's pretty obvious, that it looks like somebody's sawn the top of his head off.
That's exactly what they've done. He's had a cranial autopsy, and if you look at the cut marks all around there, you can see where the teeth of the saw have gone round.
Oh yeah, because you can actually see the jagged movements that they've made.
Right. In the 19th century, a craniotomy, removing the top of the head to look at the brain, was a common form of autopsy, especially if, like this man, the individual had suffered psychological or physical problems.
And his skull can tell us quite an interesting story.
I can see immediately that the bridge of his nose has disappeared.
Yes, it's been completely flattened, probably by a number of blows to the bridge of his nose.
So he's obviously been in a fight.
I think he's been in more than one fight. He's been in several fights. If you think of the classic boxer's nose, so it's almost straight like that. And also, he has actually lost his front teeth.
Do you think that's related to his fighting injuries?
It could well be. There's a canal that joins the nasal area to the mouth, and sometimes if that gets damaged, it can form a cyst in the area of trauma. And if you can see the shadow of a cyst, and it's got so large that actually it's worn away the bones there.
Gosh, that must have been incredibly painful.
Yeah, I mean, the pressure must have been quite uncomfortable. You could have had surgery to remove that, but he certainly wouldn't have had the money, so he would have had to have put up with that for his life.
Just from these two skeletons, it's clear that for many, the streets of early industrialised London certainly weren't paved with gold. Disease was rife, and looking at these individuals, beaten, bruised and murdered, life was pretty brutal.
Our next dig takes us to Silchester in Hampshire. Originally an Iron Age settlement, it grew into a Roman town, and since its discovery in 1864, it's been one of the richest Roman sites in Britain, offering a whole range of clues about the life of our Romano-British ancestors. Silchester is an exciting and important Roman site because the town, Caleva Atrubatum, fell into disuse rapidly and was never built over. So what we have is a perfectly preserved Roman town. University of Reading archaeologists have been digging there for more than 20 years, and this year they returned to focus on one particular area, the bathhouse. Now, this important public building should yield clues about how the Romans stamped their identity on Britain.
We've chosen the baths, one of the principal public buildings of the town, because there are questions about when the baths were built, how long they lasted, and about life in the baths. What sort of activities took place, the eating, drinking, the gambling, the hair plucking, the massage, you know, all that sort of activity. What can we trace from the soil itself and from the artefacts that we find.
Because the bathhouse was originally dug 100 years ago, Mike knows exactly where it's located. And since Silchester was never built on after the Romans left, its foundations are quickly revealed. And it's not long until the team start uncovering the precious Roman artefacts they've been hoping for.
Can we see the coin, Libby? That's really clear, isn't it?
Yeah, so you've got a little figure and maybe a spear or a flagpole or something.
Yeah.
Perhaps a torch in the other hand.
Yeah.
There is a head on the other side, but you can't see it very clearly. It doesn't have a beard, which makes it quite early in pre-Hadrian.
The discovery of such an early coin is promising. It suggests that the bathhouse must have been built by at least the early 2nd century. But what's really exciting is the discovery of personal items inside the bathhouse.
I've got a stylus. They would be used as writing implements for wax tablets, and when you hold it in your hand, you can feel how they've balanced it, which is really nice.
Not bad for day 2.
Not bad at all.
The Roman lost property provides an intriguing insight into what was going on in the bathhouse and into who was visiting it 2,000 years ago. They're finding a quantity of rings, necklaces and hairpins, suggesting that many of the bathers were women.
So here we have this bone weaving tablet that would have been used to separate the threads while they were weaving, almost complete. So whether this is specifically a lady's area, if we're finding the jewellery, the hairpins, the weaving tablets, a rather lovely find.
As the archaeologists delve deeper, they're beginning to reveal astonishing details of the form and fabric of the bathhouse itself.
The quality of the masonry, the preservation of the blocks and the bricks is absolutely superb. I mean, nowhere else, not even within Silchester, will you get preservation of this quality.
And as the dig reaches its 3rd week, the team hit the water table with astonishing results. Water begins to flow through the drains, just as it would have done 2,000 years ago. With the foundations in such great condition, the team now hopes that they'll be able to answer the real question at the heart of their mission. When was the bathhouse built? Frustratingly, this key fact has eluded them so far. But on the last day, the archaeologists finally find the evidence they need.
It looks like we found what we were hoping for from this excavation, and that is a Nero-stamped tile. When we use these tracings from existing tiles that we have, the circle fits exactly with the inner and the outer circles, so it's exactly the right dimensions to be a Nero tile.
The stamp dates the tile securely to the time of the Emperor Nero's reign, and this is much earlier than expected. I've invited dig director Mike into the lab to discuss the significance of this surprise.
Mike, you've re-excavated this bathhouse, but what you've done is found this really important bit of dating evidence that you've actually got a Nero tile associated with the bathhouse for the first time.
Yes, that's right. And this is the only place in Britain where we have these tiles.
So with Nero's name, what date does that give us?
Well, it must be sometime after 54. Nero became emperor in 54. The initial invasion began in 43. So sometime, within the first 20 years, they're building the baths. And this is one of the earliest mortared masonry, architecturally designed buildings in Roman Britain that survives.
So this is taking what was an Iron Age settlement and totally transforming it. This is now very much a Roman town on Roman plans.
This is, yes, stamping your, if you like, your symbol of Roman civilization, putting a bathhouse on what was a major Iron Age centre, which you can no longer see through that prism of the Roman town plan.
So how does this work as a building, then? You come in here, what are the various rooms?
So, peristyles, so that's you walk, exercise, warm up, then you come in. This is the changing space, and then you run through a different range of rooms, going through warm, tepidarium, to hot, the caldarium.
So this caldarium, this is where you've got the hypercaust underneath, so heated floors.
Heated floors, hot room, the furnaces outside.
So a sauna, effectively?
Yes. And then you'd round it off with the cold plunge back here.
And plenty of women, it seems, coming and using these baths.
Yes, men at the moment largely invisible. But yes, we've got a range of finger rings, of which the pièce de résistance is this gold finger ring.
Oh, isn't that lovely? Quite tiny.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
for a lady or even conceivably for a child.
Yeah.
And this is another lovely one here, but a different material. This is glass.
Oh, that's just beautiful. So these are little items, you know, personal jewellery, which people have lost at the baths.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But what they lose in abundance are these hairpins.
Yeah.
So-
It's just the same today, isn't it? It's hairbands now, I think, at the swimming baths. I'm always losing hairbands at the swimming baths. And these are bone, are they?
They're bone, yes.
Yeah, yeah. That's lovely. And do we know who was living there? I mean, is this going to be Roman citizens coming in from the Empire, or is this Brits?
I think predominantly it's Brits. I mean, the town is one of the biggest centres in Britain at the time of the Roman conquest, and a natural centre perhaps to develop.
I mean, it is just extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah, arriving in a new place and going, right, look how lucky you are.
Yes.
We've built you a bathhouse.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's a remarkable story of that early investment in Roman Britain, the confidence of Rome in its newly found province.
Early and rapid investment.
Early and rapid investment, yes.
Discovering this early date for Silchester's bathhouse is fantastic. It's fresh evidence about the determination and speed with which the Roman imperial machine stamped their mark on Britain after the conquest.
When the Romans arrive in Britain, they bring a new culture with them, including characteristic styles of architecture and clothing, pottery and glassware, and, of course, a new language. But there are other less tangible aspects of Roman culture that also arrived, ideas, stories and myths, and these are beautifully encapsulated in a fantastic artefact here in the museum. Amal, this is such a gorgeous mosaic. How was it discovered?
Well, we didn't know anything about it until 1938, when Herbert Cook, a local farmer, found a sheep dead in his field.
Right.
And he set about burying it. And in that hole, he found a little fragment of a clay tile. So he decided to take it to the museum to get it identified. It wasn't until 1945 that a schoolboy read about the tile, went to see Herbert Cook, and the two of them dug another hole, just by chance, immediately above the mosaic.
Fantastic. So if it wasn't for the dead sheep and the schoolboy, we wouldn't have this?
We wouldn't, no.
I mean, it's so beautifully preserved, isn't it? And then obviously it got lifted at some point.
Yeah, in 1953, it was quite a big operation to move it, so they stuck fabric to it and rolled it up a bit like a carpet.
That's what they're doing here. So they're just rolling it up, and you can see the pieces of tesserae there. I mean, it is a gorgeous, gorgeous mosaic, and I love the fact that it tells a story.
Yes, and in fact, it's the oldest object in Britain which tells a complete story.
Is it?
Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic.
The mosaic illustrates a chapter from one of the greatest Roman myths, written down by the Roman poet Virgil in the 30s BCE. This part focuses on the tragic love story of the legendary hero Aeneas and the Carthaginian queen Dido.
So it starts here. Aeneas is a refugee from his hometown in Troy, which is in modern-day Turkey.
Yeah.
And he's crossing the Mediterranean on his way to Italy, where it's his destiny to found the city of Rome. And his ships get wrecked on the coast of North Africa.
Right.
So it then moves to this central panel at the back.
Yeah.
And that shows Aeneas leaning nonchalantly on his spear.
Yeah.
And then...
And is that Dido
That's
then?
Dido, yeah. And next to him, Aeneas is Cupid, because Venus, who's the third figure along, who's the goddess of love and also Aeneas' mother, has decided that she wants to make Aeneas and Dido fall in love.
Okay.
So she's sent Cupid in to make that happen.
And is it working?
I think it is, yes. He's kind of plucking at her shawl, which in classical art is a sort of flirtatious gesture. So
is it?
Seems like Cupid's already working his magic. So then it moves on to the panel which shows a hunting scene. Got Dido at the back, Aeneas in the middle.
Not wearing any clothes?
No.
He's got boots on.
And a big storm happens. So Dido and Aeneas seek shelter in a cave.
Ah, right.
And that's this panel here.
Oh, so the denouement of the story. They seem to be falling in love with each other.
They do, yes. They're embracing and they spend the night together in the cave.
So what does happen at the end of the story then? Dido commits suicide?
She does, yeah. Aeneas decides to leave to get on with his mission to found Rome and set sail without telling Dido. Dido is absolutely distraught and
decides that the only option is to kill herself.
It's such a tragic story.
It is, yeah.
But it's fantastic to have this story so beautifully laid out. And you can imagine people in that villa walking around telling the stories you've just done.
Definitely. I think it's about the person who commissions the mosaic showing off his Roman heritage.
Yeah, yeah. And weaving this Roman story into the decoration of his house.
Definitely, yeah.
Our next dig is taking place in the historic city of Bath, where Wessex archaeology have been given an incredible opportunity. They're digging right in the centre, beneath Bath Abbey, one of Britain's most beautiful historic monuments, brimming with an immensely rich and ancient past.
The current abbey at Bath was largely built in the 16th century on the site of an earlier Norman cathedral, and then it was extensively renovated in the 19th century. But now its structure is under threat. The Victorian heating system desperately needs updating, and the floor is starting to collapse. Well, now there's a £19 million restoration project underway, and that's giving archaeologists a golden opportunity to investigate what lies beneath the floor of the Abbey.
The lucky team from Wessex Archaeology have 2 years to unlock the Abbey's secrets.
Welcome to day 1 of our dig diary. We're getting our tools together, getting the structures in place for us to be able to go down into the vaults.
Before the construction work happens, the archaeologists have to evaluate every inch of the site, and it's not an easy task.
This is quite a good example of how tricky some of the excavation is, and to work around lots of live surfaces. It's all very cramped in places.
The vaults lie 3.5 metres beneath street level and are crisscrossed with water pipes and cables. And the archaeologists soon discover medieval remains amongst these modern services, proof that the site is going to be highly complicated.
This man would have been absolutely huge, especially for medieval standards. So it's, yeah,
What sort of heights are we looking at?
We're looking at, yeah, about 6'5".
6'5"?
Yeah, about twice the size of me.
As well as a medieval burial, the vaults also reveal evidence of Bath's ancient Roman origins.
What we've got is demolished Roman hypocaust, which is basically an underfloor heating system.
Right.
And here we've got lots of tesserae, which would have been the mosaic floor that covered the top of it.
The team is getting plenty of glimpses of Bath's rich historic past underneath the pipes, and they're coming across some unexpected surprises too.
So we've got a really nice curving wall around here. It goes under the foundations here, so it's definitely pretty early. Also, it looks like there might be some wall facing on it, so we think they're probably upstanding walls. And potentially earlier than medieval, because there were the cloisters here, and this should have really been an open space, but there's a big wall here, so...
Who knows?
This complicated site is throwing up as many questions as answers. And as the team starts work on the floor of the Abbey itself, it soon becomes clear why it needs replacing.
This is a grave. There's a coffin underneath that's collapsed, and it's left a hole above it where all the soil's collapsed down into the coffin.
There are an estimated 9,000 burials beneath the Abbey, and insufficient underpinning explains why the Victorian floor is now collapsing. But 2 metres deeper down, the archaeologists make a completely unexpected discovery.
It's lovely, isn't it? It's Tudor green glaze. We've got an intact medieval floor surface here, decorated with these tiles. We believe this is probably late 13th or 14th century. We've got various designs. Over here, we've got the 3 lions and shields, which are the arms of the Plantagenet kings. Over here we have the arms of the De Clare family, which are powerful marching lords, and Caerphilly Castle. Quite incredible that this has survived.
This is a wonderful end to the first year of the Bath Abbey Footprint Project, so I've asked Kai into the studio to discuss these findings.
Oh, God, this is absolutely incredible. We're finding so much. You've got a real kind of microcosm of the whole history of Bath, haven't you? You're digging right back to the Roman layers and then coming through to the Norman and medieval layers.
It goes right through, and so it's really got a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the really curious thing was this curved wall. So do you know what that is now?
Possibly. So app structures, curved walls, tend to occur in two places. Either you get them in Roman buildings and you get them at the east end of churches or chapels.
Yeah.
So we're right next door to the baths, and you can see here there's a whole series of similar-looking structures. So we thought, could it be part of that? But the mortar's different. It's much more similar to the medieval structures. So the next thing we thought is, could it be part of the Norman Cathedral? And the problem is...
That's where it is.
It's here. It's right in the middle of the cloisters. And you shouldn't have any buildings in this position. This should be open space.
So this, in blue on the plan, that's the footprint of the Norman building, and these are the cloisters, and there's your apse.
That's right, yeah. So the other possibility is that it could be part of an earlier church, a late Saxon church.
Oh, really?
Now, we also have a number of Saxon burials in this area, so it could be. We just don't have quite enough to prove it at the moment.
How curious. So there's a phase of demolition in the 16th century when the new abbey is built, and then more demolition and disturbance in the Victorian period.
Yeah, so the east end of the Tudor Abbey had a fan-vaulted stone ceiling, but the nave itself, they built a wooden ceiling there with plaster decoration on it, which we've found evidence of.
Oh, this is some of it, is it?
Yeah, so when the Victorian Restoration happened, they essentially ripped out what they saw as things that didn't match the original design, which included this, and we found dozens and dozens of these little rosettes, amongst other decorated plaster. So it gives us a really good idea of what the ceiling of the Abbey looked like.
So this is Tudor?
Yes.
Yeah. And what about that tile?
So this tile, I believe this is early 15th century, and this coat of arms is the coat of arms of King Edmund, the first King of England, who was incidentally crowned at Bath Abbey. He wouldn't have recognised these arms because it was invented about 300 years after he died. But the kings of the time thought that he was a king, therefore he needed a coat of arms. So this is what they created.
I mean, that's just amazing to find those tiles. What about this coin? What's that?
Yeah, so this was a bit of a surprise. This was actually found by the workmen when they were lifting the pews inside the Abbey.
It's got a little devil on it. Yes. It says the city of the devil, Civitas Diaboli.
Yeah, and on the other side it's got a date and the name Anholt, which is an island off the coast of Denmark.
It's a recent date, 1973.
Yes.
That's actually the same vintage as me.
So we looked into this a little bit, and the date it describes is when 13 supposedly ritual sites were found on this island. One of them had a fake shrunken head on it, and people started wondering, is this some kind of cult activity? And shortly after this, these coins started appearing in churches all over Denmark and Sweden. Nobody knew where they were coming from. And then in 2013, it turned out it was all the work of a clerk at the Danish National Gallery, and it was all an elaborate hoax.
Really?
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? A little devil under the floor in Bath Abbey. Although just halfway through, this dig is already providing rare glimpses of what lies beneath one of our most treasured historic cities. And with a year to go, who knows what other secrets will be uncovered. Next, it's back to Wessex archaeology in Salisbury, where Raksha is with archaeologists who are investigating the remains of an early 19th century pauper's graveyard. And it's becoming clear just how terrible the living conditions were at the time.
Rachel, you were the site director for this excavation.
How was the preservation on site? The preservation on site was really very good. We found organic remains that we wouldn't expect to find.
So what have you got in that dish over there? Because that looks rather curious.
It is, and it's not something that you would expect to find very often. It is a desiccated brain.
That's rather small. Is that just a portion of the brain?
No, this is a complete brain. But this is a brain from a 9 or 10-year-old child.
And is that from this individual?
Yes, it is. We did find quite a large number of children, and this is one of the children that we found.
I can see here that there's green staining around the eyes.
Yes, so this is where coins were placed over the child's eyes. The parents, although they were very likely to have been incredibly poor, cared an awful lot for their children, and one of the ways they've shown that is by placing the coins on the eyes. Coins they could probably very ill afford.
And you have another child skeleton here.
Yes, we do, and this was probably the most poignant find we had from the entire site. This was an individual that still had a legible nameplate as we uncovered it. So we could decipher part of the legible nameplate, we could decipher the date she died and how old the nameplate said she was. Next to you, you'll see a photograph, and This was her nameplate. She was called Jane Clara J, and she died aged 1 year. We've been able to find her baptism certificates and her death certificates.
Do we know very much about her?
We know a little bit. We know that she was 22 months when she passed away. Her father was a labourer called George, and she lived in the Nine Elms area of Battersea.
And by studying her skeleton, can you tell how she died?
The bones tell us that it was probably some sort of chronic or severe infection that killed her.
So is infant mortality high?
Infant mortality is extremely high. In the streets surrounding this site, the infant mortality is 25% on average for this period. There's an awful lot of industrialisation within the Battersea area, so you're getting chemical factories, acid factories, some really nasty stuff, and it's quite grim living conditions for these people.
So this is very commonplace, it's literally survival of the fittest.
It's survival of the fittest and the luckiest. There were a lot of diseases like cholera, typhoid, but if you were fortunate enough you might make it to adulthood, and if you were unfortunate or unwell you would end up as poor Jane Clara J did within the cemetery.
Our final dig takes us to the ancient monument of Barrow Clump on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, where archaeologists are investigating a cache of richly furnished burials. Barrow Clump is a 3,000-year-old Bronze Age burial mound, a barrow lying just 5 miles west of Stonehenge. It's such a big feature in the landscape that 1,500 years later, the Anglo-Saxons chose to bury their dead here too. But now this site is potentially in danger of destruction. Archaeological sites can be threatened by anything from the construction of new roads and railways to coastal erosion. But at our next site, Barrow Clump, the problem was a little more unusual. Salisbury Plain is an MOD training ground, and military vehicles continually thunder by during manoeuvres. To assess whether this has caused any damage, a familiar face, MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood, is investigating with his team of ex-soldiers.
Morning one at Barrow Clump, summer 2018, stripping an area underneath the tracks to see the effective ground pressure of vehicles on the Saxon cemetery that lies below.
Only digging will reveal the true extent of this cemetery, that is, if the precious evidence hasn't been destroyed by the tanks. But the initial signs are promising.
Morning 3 on Barrow Clump, and the graves are emerging. There's an area of burning which has got human bone on top of it, and next to that there's another complete grave.
But as they dig down, the team's confidence about the level of preservation is shaken.
To the skull.
Yeah.
I believe this could be the shoulder, arm, pelvis, and then legs.
Okay, so it's looking a bit friable. The bones look a bit delicate. Is that right at the moment?
The skulls, as you can see,
yeah, it's squashed, isn't it?
Yeah.
Part of the skull there, so it's actually broken.
Okay.
The level of survival is disappointing, and for the next few days, things don't improve. But on day 4...
We have a square-headed brooch here, which probably comes in a pair, and further down the trench, there's a little bit of green coming out there.
Brooches like this are often found in graves of wealthy Anglo-Saxon women. The discovery is a welcome sign that further valuable evidence might survive. And as other burials are uncovered, the team finds grave goods often associated with male burials.
We found the grave cut that goes all the way around towards a really nice shield boss.
That's a really good nick, isn't it?
It's lovely, yeah, it's really nice.
The boss is the metal centrepiece to a wooden shield that is entirely rotted away. Anglo-Saxon men were often buried with shields laid over them. And there are more metal artefacts clearly hidden beneath the ground.
Getting a strong iron signal dead centre of the small pit there, so slowly go down.
Every bleep of the metal detector increases the anticipation on site. And on the final day, the team uncovers what for them is the most exciting find of the entire dig.
Oh, what you got?
Seem to have a sword.
That's really cool. You can see the hilt, and there's the bones, there's the arm, the humerus.
And after hours of careful excavation, the incredible preservation of this rare object is apparent.
So that's the end of the year at Barrow Clump. We've had 27 graves, and probably the most spectacular being the individual buried in the grave in front of me with his sword and all the grave fittings. A really, really astonishing sight. But this must be the most spectacular we've had so far.
I've invited Richard into the studio with that sword to discuss all of the finds from Barrow Clump this year.
It's quite incredible to think that this man, he's right underneath the tank tracks.
That's right. We were looking this year just to see how damaging our military vehicles were. The answer is actually it's not doing a huge amount of damage. And yes, this was quite a spectacular find in the last week of the dig.
You seem quite excited to find the sword at the end.
If you're digging with a military team, they all want to find weaponry. And what could be more perfect than something as wonderful as this, really?
Yeah.
It's in pretty good condition. It has the scabbard mouth there, made of bronze, possibly a horn handle to it. And then to find this with what the soldiers perceived as a warrior, is quite something. He had a spear, he had a ring-headed pin, and gloriously he had tweezers as well.
So these are tweezers?
Yeah, some iron tweezers. And we found little bronze tweezers with female beryls before, but it was good to see that he too had a part of a toilet set with him, a part of his grooming.
Yeah, he would have looked after himself.
Yeah, absolutely so.
And, of course, just because you found weaponry, a magnificent sword and a spear, you can't assume that this is a male burial. But I think this time, I mean, it's very obvious, isn't it? These are very long bones, large joints. Looking at the jaw, that's an incredibly robust jawline there.
Well, that's very masculine, then.
Yeah.
In this case, they do seem to be quite gender-specific on our site, and the burials with jewellery are of females and the weaponry are of males. So that's what we've got at Barrow Clump.
So you have got quite a few female burials, and these are some of the beads from those then?
Yes, these are just one collection of grave goods from a female burial, but
From
really,
one burial?
From one burial, yes. They all come. They're absolutely stunning, aren't they? With the iridescent blues and the orange ambers and the glass. Really, really exquisite items.
Really lovely.
And you've got soldiers arguing who's got the prettier jewels in the grave they're digging. It's not something they'd probably have expected in the mess 10 years before. And really excitingly with this one was this little brooch, because this is a one-off from a grave in Britain. This is Visigothic. The Visigoths, a group that's moved from Germany to northern Spain or southern France, and it gives us all those sort of questions as to whether the individual was accompanied with these things, whether she was in fact from that region or whether she's a British woman that's adopted fashions of another grouping.
I think identity is really difficult in this period, well, any period, actually, because she might have had some Visigoth ancestry whilst growing up in this country. We
Completely
can't
that,
tell
and we've had
moment.
Roman brooches as well, so that also asks the questions whether these are heirlooms or whether they've just been found on Salisbury Plain, which is always a possibility given the amount of archaeology there.
Yeah, and do we know where these people lived? I mean, is there a settlement nearby?
Good Saxon place names of Ablington and Fildene, which is just below it on the River Avon, both mentioned in the Domesday Book. I think that probably is where they're living, just down the hill.
And then presumably choosing to site their cemetery further up the hill where there are Bronze Age barrows up there.
I think it's that continuity of landscape, isn't it? People are using that landscape as a venerated spot. They're looking up onto the hillside. And I do think that these places were significant in the Saxon period with the knowledge that they were where ancestors, for want of a better word, were placed in prehistory.
Each and every dig reveals how archaeology can shed new light on the story of Britain. From discovering why HMS Invincible transformed British sea power in the 18th century, to revealing the horrific realities of life and death for London's poor 150 years ago. Our ancestors made the country we live in today, and through archaeology we've been able to reach back through the centuries and touch their lives.